Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. A few months ago, I met Brandy, and she invited me to be a visiting scholar at Citrus, and it's been a really great thing for me to have an academic home. After leaving Oxford and coming out to Silicon Valley, it was really jarring, as you might imagine. I didn't speak that language, and so it's nice to be able to come here to Berkeley and see you all. So when I first got interested in studying propaganda, it was about 10 years ago. During my master's degree. What happened was I was working for the Obama campaign at the time. I was working as an organizing fellow. And what I realized was that the data scientists who were working on the campaign were the true rock stars. They were the people who were scouring data on independent voters. And actually what we were doing at the time was calling all these independent voters on the phone. And we knew, based upon their voter records and based upon the records that the campaign had, eerily, that they were interested in XYZ things. So if someone was interested in gun control, we could talk to them about that. And I began to think to myself, wow, technology is going to play a serious role in politics in the future, obviously a no-brainer. But the profusion of data that exists on voters is going to be a really exciting thing, potentially in the future of political campaigning and political communication. At the time, I myself was very much in the cyber optimist camp, and I still kind of am, reluctantly to some degree. But I began studying the Tea Party. And I wrote my master's thesis on how the Tea Party used Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals in kind of what I called at the time a reverse reading, basically a bunch of conservative people picking up this liberal labor organizing book and then using it to online and disseminating it online in order to train their people. And I started to realize, this is a really interesting space. Maybe I should look a little bit more into the way that technology facilitates the spread of both information, but also misinformation, and also complete opposite types of readings of information. Today, the talk's going to be called Propaganda Ethics and the Future of Technology Design. I work at the Institute for the Future. That's my day job. And next year, I'll be joining the faculty at the University of Texas in the School of Journalism. But our lab, what we do is we do forecasting on the ways that technology is being used. We look at signals from today and say, we should potentially be concerned with things like VR or AR and the ways that they might be misused. And what I'm going to do today is present to you a solution as well at the end, or a solution of sorts, to help us think ethically about design. It's called Ethical OS. Before I get there, though, I want to... the clicker's not working, sorry. Before I get there, though, I want to talk to you about this kind of shift that we've seen in the last few years. I am, methodologically speaking, an ethnographer. I do research in the field. I've taken classes in coding, but I'm not a computer coder. I am not a computer scientist. But what I do is hang out with people who make and build technology. And so when I came up with the computational propaganda project with my advisor when I first joined the University of Washington, what we said was we wanted to study the people who were making and building bots that were being used for political purposes. And back then, we didn't really know what the parameters of the project were going to be. But we knew that we'd seen social media being used for all sorts of positive causes during Occupy and the Arab Spring, and I'll get there in just a second. But we also knew that during that same time, there was manipulation going on, and it wasn't really being covered in the press. And so we wanted to talk to the people who were doing that manipulating. We kind of had this idea that while Silicon Valley was founded on this idea of cyber utopianism and to some extent cyber libertarianism, in some ways there was cyber autocracy creeping in on the sides. The Arab Spring was a time when everyone was extremely, extremely excited about social media. They called the Egyptian Revolution and the Tunisian Revolution Twitter revolutions. And the idea there was that social media was playing an infrastructural role in organizing and communication during that uprising. Activists were able to share information on where they were going to meet, but also the government was able to track where the activists were chatting. They were able to follow the hashtags. And so simultaneously, we saw this push and pull of democratic sharing of information over social media, but also attempts to wholesale shut down the internet in some of these countries. Today we're in a different space. We've had these discussions about the ways in which politics has been moving, globally speaking, in a more populist direction, especially in America and Western Europe, but also throughout South America. And the ways in which groups like the alt-right have taken up digital technology as a means for communicating all sorts of types of information and for organizing themselves in a way that we previously didn't really think about when we were designing tools like Reddit or YouTube or Facebook. In many of my conversations with people who work at those companies, they say to me, when we were building, we scaled really fast and we thought about the ways that this could be used as a positive democratic tool, but we didn't really think in our wildest dreams that powerful political actors or fringe activists or extremists, if you want to call them that, would use our tools as mechanisms to amplify their platforms for hate. The thing that concerns me about what's going on now and amongst all the other craziness is that it challenges the existing mental models that people have and the ways that people think. The internet's an exciting place for people to get all sorts of different kinds of information, and the idea of the information superhighway was that people would be able to access any text or any sort of information suddenly and efficiently. But the problem there also is that anyone can access any sort of information, and also that anyone can become a journalist. That was supposed to be one of the positive things about the net, but it's also one of the negative things. And so we found out pretty quickly that when anyone becomes a journalist online, anyone is able to effectively disseminate disinformation online. And tools like bots and computational propaganda, which we define as the use of automation and algorithms over social media to manipulate public opinion, have made it possible for small groups of people acting as journalists, and I say that in air quotes, or as pundits, to massively amplify their perspective when there's only a few of them. So what we've had happen is something that I call manufacturing consensus, and I'll get a little bit more into that soon, but it's basically giving information the illusion of popularity in order to make it so that more people pay attention. It causes a bandwagon effect. I want to make a point today, and that's that while we were worried about things like bots, automated software programs that get used on social media, but also all over the internet for automated tasks, while we're specifically worried about political bots, these profiles on social media that look like real people but that are actually automated, we have to think beyond bots. We have to think beyond these things. We can't just be worried about the ways that a trending algorithm might be manipulated. We also have to be worried about virtual reality, augmented reality. You've probably heard the term deep fakes. Well, videos that are manipulated in order to look like something happened when it actually didn't. They're worrying, and the machine learning capacity of that kind of technology is worrying, but there's things beyond that that we should also be considering. And so what I tell people when I talk about the future of propaganda is that you can't only focus upon what happened in 2016. You can't only focus on what's happening now in 2018, and I'll get into that in a bit. You've got to think 5, 10 years out if you really want to effectively begin to address the problem. This is not just a problem of politics. Computational propaganda exists in multiple different domains. And in fact, at the Institute for the Future, one of my jobs is working with all sorts of corporate entities and private entities to help them address the reasons and ways in which this kind of misinformation and manipulation is happening in their domain. There's a picture of a vaccine here. One of the recent studies that we've done with a major pharmaceutical company and several other groups, including the Gates Foundation, studies the ways in which propaganda flows around vaccination and anti-vaccination online. There's a recent report, research report on this that was really fantastic that came out a couple months after we had worked on our internal report. And what it shows is that a tremendous amount of dis and misinformation about vaccination is spread on Facebook and Twitter. And oftentimes it's the same 10,000 or so people that are doing the spreading of the information, but they're bolstered by hundreds of thousands of fake profiles across myriad social media platforms. And the fallout of this is very real. It's very tangible. While we're worried about the ways in which propaganda online might affect voting and the ways in which the 2016 vote changed in one way or another, it's really difficult to track or to measure that. What we can measure, however, is the rise in yellow fever in Brazil, or outbreaks of measles in San Francisco. And so the fear here is that the more disinformation that spreads online and the more that anyone can become an information purveyor using the internet, the more mis and disinformation will be spread about vaccinations. And so we've got to challenge social media companies and others, people, generally speaking, to think about the information that they see online in a very nuanced way and what gets shown there and what doesn't. I have a few copies of this report we just put out. That's the cover right there. I'm happy to share them with you. I only have like 10. But it's called State-Sponsored Trolling. And this report came out a few months ago in collaboration with Bloomberg. And it was a big research study that we did over the course of 2 years. I used to be a research fellow at Jigsaw, and we started studying this stuff. Jigsaw is Google's think tank and incubator for sort of human rights-centered technology, or that's how they think of themselves anyway. And we started thinking about this stuff while I was there, but this never got published. And we were working with, at the time, with the International Press Institute and Global Voices to try to figure out the ways in which governments were using social media as a tool for attacking their own people. And so we understood that during elections and security crises, powerful political actors, governments, militaries, what have you, were using bots, armies of fake profiles, in attempts to make themselves look more popular or to sort of manipulate the conversations that were going on and try to control them. But what we didn't think as much about at the time were the human effects of propaganda. And what this report details is 8 different country case studies in which journalists, women, and ethnic minorities are targeted by government actors, verifiably, using social media. And so what we did was we talked to the people who built the tools, and we also talked to people who were on the receiving end of the tools, and then we did some pretty significant data analysis to study the ways in which these campaigns played out in places like Turkey or Ecuador. We also daringly discussed the United States and the way that the United States government is also using social media as a mechanism for trying to stifle the dissent. The Turkish case is particularly illuminating. The Turkish case shows a situation in which the Kurds, the minority population in Turkey, female journalists and others are targeted by the Erdogan regime using tools like Twitter and Facebook. Erdogan himself openly admitted several years ago that his party and he himself, not he himself because he probably doesn't know how to use a computer that well, made use of tens of thousands of bots in attempts to amplify the position of their party, in attempts to attack the Kurds, and in attempts to attack journalists. And so this case is really humanizing in the sense that we talked to the people who were on the receiving end of those attacks. One is a BBC journalist, another is a journalist at another publication. And what we discuss is the ways in which state-sanctioned campaigns were actually leveraged against Turkish citizens and citizens of countries like the United States and England. But at the same time this was happening, the opposition was also making use of bots and was also making use of computational propaganda and was also attempting to curb the communication of the regime. And so what ended up happening in Turkey and what's happened in countries like Ukraine and like Ecuador is that Twitter has effectively become so noisy during moments of political crisis or elections that people no longer use it as a tool for communication and organizing in the same way they were using it a few years before. There's a fear that what they say online will be held against them offline. And in the case of Mexico, in this publication, there was offline deaths that resulted after online comments. And so we're starting to see the transcendence of that. I brought up this idea of manufacturing consensus. Obviously, it's a riff on Chomsky's idea of manufacturing consent. But the idea here is that social media gets used as a tool for amplifying or creating the illusion of popularity for a candidate or a political idea or a concept about anti-vax, to give it this like popularity that it didn't have before. Think about Donald Trump, the candidate in 2012, and then think about Donald Trump, the candidate in 2016, as a thought exercise. His Twitter following went up tenfold in between that time. And of course, he used the Obama birth certificate as a means to become more popular. But at the same time, he figured out that Twitter was a mechanism that he could use to massively bolster his voice. Most politicians like Donald Trump, but also Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, have nearly 50% of their following on Twitter as bots. They're fake. This has serious ramifications for the way that people perceive the information. And so the idea of manufacturing consensus is that when you blow up a politician on a site like Twitter and make them look more popular, that they get more of a platform. And so one of the things we've said is that the future of political communication online isn't grassroots. It's not coming from the people. It's AstroTurf. It's fake. It's put together by small groups of people in a room and then launched to the populace. And there's a really crucial thing here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Brexit. The really crucial thing here is that oftentimes when I talk to people who make and build political bots on a site like Twitter or on Reddit or YouTube, they tell me, I don't build bots in any way, shape, or form to talk to people. The goal is not to change the way that you or I perceive a certain story or a piece of information oftentimes, but it's to trick the algorithm on a site like Twitter or on a site like YouTube to prioritize the content that I'm trying to share by making it look more popular. So if I have 10,000 bots retweet a comment on something that has a particular hashtag, say hashtag alt-right, then potentially what will happen is a trend will be created on Twitter, and then it'll show up on everyone's dashboard or on the homepage of YouTube. And this is what happened with the Sandy Hook shooting. There was a particular video that was a fake Sandy Hook video that said they were character actors that was massively shared by automated accounts and a fringe group online. And it made that video the #1 trending video on YouTube. During Brexit, while I was at Oxford, we studied the ways in which bots were being used to promote either the Leave campaign or the Stay campaign for the UK, to stay in the EU or to leave the EU. And at first, what we found was that a tiny percentage of the population that was tweeting about Brexit was bots. And so we thought, oh, this is not very exciting. Maybe this is a null result. But then when we looked a little bit further, we found that that tiny percentage, under 1% of the campaign of the profiles that were tweeting about Brexit, accounted for over 99% of all of the traffic during the 7 days preceding the Brexit vote for the Leave campaign. So I'll say that one more time. Under 1% of the accounts that were tweeting about the Leave campaign accounted for 99% of all of the tweets about Leave. And so when you talk about astroturfing, you talk about the idea of manufacturing consensus, what you're talking about is thousands and thousands of accounts that are run by a few people that give, again, the illusion of popularity to an event that make people think, in this case, potentially, this was one of the tweets that went viral during Brexit, actually from a real person, that this is a real viable option, and my neighbor thinks that it's good, my politician thinks that it's good, and so I should. And the reason I say my politician thinks that it's good is that when we did the US case study in 2016, my colleague Doug Gilbo at the University of Pennsylvania and I, we found that bots were retweeted by people in the highest levels of politics in the United States. Not just Donald Trump, but Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, all of these people, Sean Hannity, but also Rachel Maddow, they were reposting content that was coming from bots. And what happens when a thought leader reposts content that comes from someone who's trying to manipulate public opinion, that's trying to spread misinformation? I brought up the point that a lot of the time, people who are building the tools of computational propaganda aren't trying to change the way you think or feel about an issue. So if they're trying, like directly, so to speak, they're not sending out a bot army. Oftentimes people come up to me after my talks and they say, I don't talk to any bots on Twitter. Like, they're really obviously bots, and I've never believed something that some account that I didn't know shared with me. But what I've learned from talking to people who make and build these tools is that sometimes the goal isn't to change how we think or what we think. It's to cement what we already believe. And so in the case of 2016 during the US election, the conversations that we had with some of the bot builders that we were in contact with, some of them in country, actually most of them in country in the United States, US citizens that were building bots to try to build up their own perspective, they said, we want to make people who think like we do sort of more firm in their beliefs. The goal was to create, to polarize, to create a division within publics. And so this is particularly frightening to me in an era where most people get their news about politics or about the world online. And when they see what they see on Facebook news feeds or on Twitter's stream, and there's changes that have been made, and we can discuss that in the Q&A potentially, but in some ways it's too little too late. I worry that companies like Twitter and Facebook, well, I don't worry so much as I think that maybe companies like Twitter and Facebook have it's gone too far, that they risk becoming legacy social media, so to speak, as quickly as they became new media. So the question is, what's next? What are the next types of social media that will emerge? Right now, my lab at Institute for the Future is doing a series of case studies on the 2018 midterms. And I mentioned the idea of humanizing computational propaganda before. We're calling this humanizing the consequences of computational propaganda. It's kind of a mouthful, but the idea here is that in 2016, and after 2016, 2017, and now, we heard a lot about groups like Cambridge Analytica, and a lot about Russian interference in the United States election. And the concern, in a lot of ways, was that these groups were using disinformation, so purposefully spread information, or misinformation, accidentally spread by our friends and family, in attempts to manipulate public opinion on a very individual level. Cambridge Analytica called it psychographic marketing. The idea was that if Cambridge Analytica claimed to have profiles on 230 million Americans. They claimed to have gotten that data from Facebook, but also from credit companies and a number of other sources. I actually, back in 2016, during the New York primary, was in a basement in Chelsea with 8 other people when Ted Cruz was running against Donald Trump, listening to Ted Cruz's media advisors talk about how they were using psychographics to try to target Ted Cruz supporters. That group was Cambridge Analytica. They didn't work for Trump back then. And they basically opened up their playbook and told us everything that they did. And what I realized really quickly was that they weren't using individual targeting. They were targeting groups. They were targeting social groups. They were targeting issue voters. The idea that they had was, we have data on some people that say believe in gun control or believe in gun rights or that believe in abortion and that's the thing that they vote on in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Let's target those folks. And so it was in a lot of ways the same demographic type of marketing that's existed in political communication for a really long time. And so what I thought back then and what I think now, and the reason we're doing this particular study, is that the way that you shift the vote, the way that you really change something on a national level isn't necessarily by targeting individuals, although I'm sort of fearful that that might be what happens in the future with advances in machine learning and deep learning, but rather the ways in which women's rights advocates, or I've mentioned gun control, gun rights, that's another case study, Indian Americans, LGBTQ groups, environmental activists, how these people are being targeted with propaganda online, and how that propaganda is affecting the way that they see the internet, but also the chilling effects that are happening, the ways that these people are leaving the online sphere and not discussing politics anymore because they're so often disproportionately targeted, not only with propaganda and disinformation, but also with political harassment. So what happens when that one person on Twitter attacks you and trolls you? That's scary and it makes you feel uncomfortable. Well, what happens when 1,000 accounts attack you that all look real? That's really scary. And so some of these circumstances are us talking to activists or us talking to people on both sides of the aisle. One of our cases is on centrist Republican groups and the ways in which they've been targeted by foreign nationals, by a number of different people in country in attempts to sway them one way or the other. And it's painting a very bleak picture of 2018. I think I'm quite hopeful because of the polls, but I was also quite hopeful because of the polls in 2016 about the strength of democracy. But at the moment, what we're seeing online is that the changes that have been made by the social media firms and the questions that have been raised by academics like me, but also by a profusion of journalists, have not been significant enough. We haven't seen significant enough change to actually affect what's happening online. And that's not even to begin speaking about policy. So one of the things the state-sponsored trolling report does is it gets into the policy. It gets into US policy, EU policy, and international law. And it discusses the potential routes we could take to try to fight back against social groups like this being targeted. But what we quickly realize is that in a country like the United States, when Congress is as divided as it is, that we cannot look to the national government for any kind of solutions. And international law, as the lawyers in the crowd know, is tricky and also very, very challenging to enforce when it comes to things like this. We called state-sponsored trolling a new form of human rights abuse, and I stand by that, and I think that it's actually what's happening. And so the hope is that in these kinds of circumstances, when hate crimes effectively are being perpetuated using propaganda, using social media, that we have a clearer avenue to prosecute the people who are actually doing this. That's if we can catch them. Because remember, one of the biggest reasons that computational propaganda exists, and one of the main differences in this type of propaganda compared to other types of propaganda that have existed for eons, is that it's anonymous. And also it's automated. It just so happens that those two words are both, they both start with A's, which is a nice like sort of synchronicity. But anonymity is a tool that allows people to act without the thought of repercussion, and automation scales it. So I'm going to end on a little bit of a happier note, because spending the last 6 years studying computational propaganda, it's been depressing at times, as you might imagine. And so I got together with a friend and colleague named Jane McGonigal. She's a female game designer. She's fantastic. And Jane and I, with some support from the Midyar network, designed what we call the ethical operating system, the ethical OS. And as you see here, we call it a guide to anticipating the future impact of today's technology. We wanted to call it originally not the ethical operating system, but we wanted to call it how not to regret the things you build. But Midyar didn't like that. So what this is a toolkit that challenges the people who make and build technology to think about the potential repercussions of what they build. So Silicon Valley scaled really fast. Facebook had the motto of move fast and break things. In some ways, we're advocating for slow technology, but in other ways, we're saying maybe don't move fast and break things. Maybe slow down a little bit and think about the ethics of what you build, because it matters. We have 8 risk zones that we've outlined for the ethical operating system. Risk zone 1 is truth, disinformation, propaganda, addiction to dopamine economy, economic and asset inequalities, machine ethics and algorithmic biases, the surveillance state, data control and monetization, implicit trust and user understanding, and hateful and criminal actors. The idea here is that we've built this series of tools. We've kind of gamified it, because that's where Jane's brilliance lies, and built this toolkit that asks a series of questions where people go through it. Maybe you're a program manager or a project manager with your team, and you say, hey, let's ask a bunch of questions about like how people might misuse this tech. I listen to Audible all the time, so I'm a big fan of audiobooks. And it's hard for me to think about the way that the Audible app might be misused, but it doesn't hurt when you're building a tool to sit down and ask questions about how it might be misused, no matter how benign the tool might seem on face value. We all know this is true after seeing some of the most popular tools, online tools, apps being used in ways that we never planned for them to be used to manipulate us. Right now, what we're presenting is this toolkit, and you can look at it. It's on, if you Google ethical OS, you'll find our website. And if you have ideas for the types of questions we can ask, or who we should be reaching out to, or like how we should speak about this, please send us emails. We're accepting all sorts of ideas right now, but we're also presenting it to some of the biggest companies in the Valley, where we've had beta tests. I can't say the companies right now, but at some really promising places and had some really promising results. We're also in talks with several journalistic entities, big ones here in the United States, about testing this for their journalists as well. And Jane is putting together a MOOC right now through Stanford. I know that's a dirty word here, but through Stanford, I could do one at Berkeley maybe, to present this toolkit to thousands and thousands of people around the world. Because we don't just think that it's for technology designers, we think it's for everyone. We think that everyone should be educated about what goes into the tools that they use every day. And we're not necessarily, we're not thinking about this in a completely tech solutionist way. We think that there's absolutely social solutions to this problem. We think that part of those social solutions is educating people about the ways that tech gets misused. And so those 8 risk zones really highlight what the effects are for society of particular types of technologies. If you'd like to send me an email, here's my email, and my Twitter handle is just there. And I'm happy to chat anytime. Thank you.
Because I have the mic, I'm going to ask the first question.
Okay.
Take my privilege here.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm a huge fan of Chomsky, and so I caught right away when he said manufacturing consensus, and I thought that is brilliant, and I wish I would have thought of it, but I didn't. So with manufacturing consent, it's the role of mass media in perpetuating propaganda that's beholden to other market and ideological forces. So how do we mitigate this manipulation in an era of anonymity and automation on social media? Or are we just doomed? Will these systems always be manipulated by certain actors to gain their ideological stance?
Thank you, Brandy. It's a really great question. The benefit of being in a place like Oxford is that you have a lot of time to think because there's not very many distractions and it's raining all the time. And so I was reading Chomsky and I thought, oh my God, like social media, many-to-many media and propaganda gets spread on this by all sorts of different kinds of people. And kind of along the way, I kind of considered this idea that maybe the ability to propagandize online has been democratized, like almost anyone can do it. We have an undue focus upon Russian propaganda and the way that powerful political actors are manipulating our thoughts, potentially, or what we see online. But what we forget to think about sometimes is what the companies themselves make possible. So the fact that Facebook has had a congressional map available to its the people that buy advertisements on it for like 6 years now, or something like that, since 2014, 4 years. And what that means is that when you purchase advertisements and you try to connect to people, you can say, I want to connect with people in this district in Wisconsin, and up until right now, today, people haven't really been thinking about who was buying or selling those ads, and we still don't have a requirement, really, other than Facebook's own internal requirement, to say who's purchasing the ads. The Federal Elections Commission, and sorry, I'm going to get to what you asked in just a second. The Federal Elections Commission in 2001 or so decided that they weren't going to moderate political communication online, and that was mostly to do with email back then. They didn't even think about what was going to happen with social media, and so this problem of manufacturing consensus, in the sense that it's like, many-to-many propaganda, and it's propaganda that exists over social media, which up until really recently, these sorts of companies have made the argument, and you've probably heard this a million times, we're not the arbiters of truth, but in fact, that manufacturing consensus is being spread on curatorial platforms that curate information for people, that have trends, that have news feeds, that absolutely take inputs and give specific outputs to you and I. They prioritize what kind of news we see. It's a really challenging problem. The idea of manufacturing consent was easier to wrap your head around because it had this idea that journalists were perpetuating top-down power. They were picking up power from militaries or from governments and then regurgitating it. Manufacturing consensus in a lot of ways is exactly the same. 15% of the US population uses Twitter. which is a small percentage, and it's probably shrinking every day. But a huge percentage, and I don't know exactly what it is, of prominent US journalists use Twitter. What happens when journalists see computational propaganda and regurgitate it? One of the things we don't talk about a lot of the time because we're so fearful of the press already being attacked by our current administration is that a lot of the computational propaganda that got spread during 2016 was actually propaganda spread by journalists who had thought they saw a trend on social media. Nothing drives me more crazy than when I see a journalist saying there's a trend on social media right now surrounding this topic. I'm like, oh my God, like you have no idea who's creating this. How many bots are there?
So quick question. You haven't talked much about the technology that could probably be used to create countermeasures to this. Technology that can be used in a defensive way, for example, identifying the sources of propaganda, maybe do some fact testing, and so on and so forth. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. A lot of times when I think about this, I think that bots, while they're the tools that get used to perpetuate propaganda, they're also potentially solutions to propaganda. And over the course of the years that we've been studying this stuff, we've been approached by a number of different governments, militaries, corporations that say, why can't we just build pro-democratic propaganda? And I get really scared when I hear that because I'm like, oh, and that's not to say it's not already happening, by the way. We just aren't studying it as much. They're saying, why can't we build democratic bot armies or why can't we build an army of bots that promote vaccination or these sorts of things? And so that's on the one hand a very blunt way of using bots, but I also think bots can be a really useful tool as sort of a social prosthesis or like a civic scaffolding to connect, say, journalists who are reporting on the same topic. One of the other ways we thought about it at the Institute is that we could use bots to search people's LinkedIn pages and find out if they're teachers and they're teaching on a certain subject and to connect them to one another, because oftentimes teachers have such a deficit of resources that they aren't able to really get help from their districts, but they might be able to get help from one another. And so bots are really effective at parsing data in a really, really quick way. And so we thought maybe that would be a way. In regards to fact checking, there's a group called First Draft out at Harvard, and Claire Wardle is leading that group, and they're doing some of the most innovative work when it comes to fact checking. But most of the research that's out there right now shows that fact checking on social media is pretty ineffective. In fact, it cements people's views more than it changes their views, because once you get to the time where they've seen the content, they've said they believed it, they've publicly agreed, and then you fact check them, it either doesn't get read or it angers them. People don't like being duped, but at the same time, traditional modes of fact checking are proving pretty ineffectual. And so I think we have to think about ways of catching the content as it happens and flagging it as misuse. But and here's where I point the finger at Facebook and Google. The burden of fact checking has not been put upon the companies themselves or on the US government in any way, shape, or form. And I don't know if we want that anyway, given our current situation, but it's been put upon groups like Snopes or the Associated Press. They're the ones that are allegedly having to fact check and making partnerships with Facebook. But I've spoken to people at both of those organizations about these efforts. And they say, we're already tiny companies. The Associated Press, like, we're already an organization that has suffered mightily because of social media's rise. And now we're attempting to fact check articles. And basically the mechanism what happens there is the social media company says, hey, we think that this thing about the Irish potato famine might be fake. Can you fact check it? And then Snopes goes back to them and says, can you show us data as to like why you think it might be fake? And they're like, nope, you just need to fact check it. We can't share any data with you because then we're getting into proprietary issues. And so there's possibilities for fighting back, and certainly literacy is one of them. I think about them in the short term, medium term, and long term. But I think that we have to start seeing a certain amount of the burden being taken by the companies themselves. They're multi-billion-dollar companies, and it can't just be little technological tweaks that try to amend a problem that's 15 years old at this stage. It's got to be some serious efforts to partner with myriad different groups to address this issue, not just internal.
Hi, thank you for your talk today, Samuel. You mentioned about the impact of bots, the devastating impact. I'm just wondering from more technical point of view, how do you differentiate where the sources are the bots? Or are you just hypothesizing based on certain traits that these are the bots?
So it's a really tricky question, and it's not one that is simple. So many of you in the audience probably have heard of Botometer. It used to be called Botternaut, and it's a product from Indiana University, from a great lab out there. It's kind of become, for us, those of us doing open source intelligence work looking at bots, it's kind of become the industry standard. Botometer has an open API where we can plug in thousands and thousands of accounts. You pay a subscription fee, and they run it based upon hundreds of different metrics. So it's not just like how many followers the account has versus how many people it's following, because oftentimes that's a metric. Like, these bots follow tons of people, but they have no followers. It's not just a metric of the network looking really suspicious, so all the bots are built to follow themselves, i.e. a botnet or a bot network. And it's also not just that they're tweeting every minute, because that's also a pretty good signifier. It's all of these sorts of things and more. And but that platform is not itself perfect. I think actually it underreports the amounts of bots that exist. It's not that we get a lot of false positives or false negatives. It's that most of the time it says that, like, the accounts we are pretty sure are bots, it says with 50% accuracy they're bots. And so what I've had to do, and I think the reason why qualitative research has played such an important role in this, is talk to people who are making and building bots. And it took 2 or 3 years to actually find some of those people. But then they started sharing lists of 10,000 accounts or so that they had created that were bots, and said, yeah, these are my bots, here's the code, look at it. And we had some of our data scientists look over it. And we knew that those accounts were bots. So oftentimes what we've had to do is pair qualitative insight with quantitative insight. And so in the past, there's been problems with some of the research that's come out, in that it's been facile, the way that the bots have been detected, and said, like, you know, if they tweet a certain amount of times a day, we're going to look at them. But the distinction I think that's really important to make here is that, well, God. The distinction I think that's really important to make here, before I slip off the stage, is that, see, the bots almost got me, is that the distinction between a human and a bot is kind of like up for grabs. And we've identified a lot of accounts as being bots in the past, and like actually like outed them, for lack of a better word. These accounts, some of them, one of them in particular I'm thinking of, had tweeted over 1 million times in 2016 alone, only about politics. And we got a call from a guy in Chicago who said, I'm not a bot, that's my account. And this account, these other 100 accounts are all my accounts too. I just use software to bolster my voice. He didn't say that. He said, I use this thing to make my, you know, to automate my tweets. And I said, well, those are bots. And so there's kind of this like clinical decision a lot of the time when we talk about bots to separate them from the people that they build. But actually, my wife and I, who's in the audience right now, she's also a researcher, and Phil Howard, the director of Oxford Internet Institute, wrote a paper recently called The Bot Proxy. And it's in ZZ Papakrisi's new network self volume. Which one is it? Platform Stories and Connections, ZZ Papakrisi's thing. And the argument we make there is that bots are proxies for their creators. And so, like, while we can identify that there's XYZ amount of accounts that are tweeting using automated behavior, oftentimes they're doing what the creator wants them to do. And so we need to try to break down this binary distinction between like humans and bots. What's more interesting to me to say is that this amount of accounts tweeted hundreds of thousands of times during this political event, regardless of whether they were bots or people, they were having an undue effect, and they were communicating and being retweeted by this amount of people. And so we've used other mechanisms like K-core analysis and stuff to figure out like the centrality of accounts and how many times they're getting retweeted by politicians or by celebrities to try to ascertain effects. But it's a growing science, and it's imperfect at the moment.
Thanks for your talk, Samuel. It was really great. And I have 3 simple questions. The first one is, do you think media literacy, better and more media literacy, is the best solution for this problem, or the society will always be subject to manipulation? And the second one is, who is more responsible for this, like the companies, the lack of policies, or the users that use social media? And the last one is, Which do you think will be the impact of artificial intelligence in social media manipulation?
Great questions. So, remind me what your first one was again?
Media literacy.
Oh, media literacy is always important. It's going to be important, like, for as long as we have media. The question is to which, like, how many people we can get media literacy campaigns. And so, I think of the solutions to this problem in short-term, medium-term, long-term. And if the short-term solutions are the technological tweaks the company's making, then media literacy campaigns are really long-term solutions. So there's a number of groups that are doing really great work on this. It's just not within my realm of expertise. I think that media literacy is important, and I tend to disagree with people who discount it right away. The second question, remind me? Who's more responsible? The platforms and governments I hold equally responsible. So the platforms, it doesn't matter if you were a wide-eyed kid when you created Facebook or whatever. What matters is that this tool that you built for dissemination of information is being misused, and so you have to take some kind of responsibility. The way I've been thinking about it lately is that Facebook and Twitter, this is kind of a weird analogy, but how many of you remember TV Land, the channel? So like TV Land ran reruns of Nickelodeon and of like I Love Lucy and of all these things, but they got to decide when those shows happened. They got to decide which shows they showed on their channel, and they were a curating channel. But the FEC was still, or sorry, not the FEC, the FCC was still in charge of moderating what they showed. Facebook doesn't have, they're a curator, much like TV Land. They reproduce these kinds of content, but they don't have any accountability, and that gets to the governmental problem. The government doesn't know what to do, and as you heard in Brandy's introduction, I presented this research to people at the highest levels of government in a number of different countries, and it is like pulling teeth, honestly, because what they want is like a soundbite or something, and we talk to these folks actively. Like a lot of my colleagues talked to these people during the Zuckerberg hearings, and the questions that got asked were like, what we had said was like the polar opposite to what got asked. And so we're like, okay, well, this isn't a clear conduit. Social media companies will have you think that the user bears the responsibility for solving this problem. I think that the user is already overwhelmed with a tremendous amount of information. I think that some user-based fixes are good, but I don't think that only user-based fixes are the solution. And the last one is that AI and machine learning, they're definitely the future of computational propaganda. What happens when we have bots that are actually smart, that can speak and have a reasonable conversation with us and really look like people? Right now, these accounts are really blunt. They're really, like, for lack of a better word, they're really crappy. They don't do very much. They are built to like content or retweet content wholesale. And so it's just like, they're not achieving that yet, but they will, I think.
Okay, I think with that, let's thank Sam for a really insightful discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.